When one of us is tired out, the other one will hold it down. We're gonna spread the love, we're gonna spread it around. We're all over the city now, and way down in the underground. Come on! To fight the system, to fight the system. It's a good day. It's a to fight the system, to fight the system. It's a good day. It's a to fight the system, to fight the system. It's a good day. It's a good day. To fight the system, to fight the system. It's a
Well, hello everybody, and good evening. On some still sunshiny evening as we progress into spring and summer. We want to welcome you all to the Building Tenant Power Workshop, Defending Seattle's Renter Protections. For those of you that haven't already done it, please put your name and pronouns in the chat and what neighborhood or city that you live in. We're gonna get started here, and I am Tanya Moore. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the operations director and co-director with at B Seattle. I'm joined tonight by our organizing director, Kate Rubin, and our programs assistant, Dee Powers. And I'm going to start us off with a land acknowledgement today. We are in the land of the Coast Salish peoples. I would like to recognize that we are occupying the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. As we do this important work on these lands, we understand that our collective liberation cannot happen without Indigenous sovereignty. We encourage each of you to sign the petition for federal recognition of the Duwamish tribe, and if you're able, visit the Longhouse and pay rent to the Duwamish. You can learn more from Real Rent Duwamish, and the links will be dropped in the chat. We'll include a link for them in the resource guide that we will send out after the presentation as well. Our resource guide also contains contact information for the Renting in Seattle helpline, the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections, also known as SCCI. They're responsible for enforcing landlord-tenant laws, the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, as well as a bunch of other organizations that provide services to renters. We encourage you to get more involved with B Seattle. We are always seeking table volunteers, flyer friends, people interested in developing their skills as part of our tenant leadership teams. We host 2 renter council meetings every month. The Elder Renter Council, which centers around renters ages 55 and up, and the Seattle Renter Organizing Council, or SROC. These councils were created for renters to work together to strategize and fight for renter protections that they feel are important to their community, give and receive peer-to-peer support, for folks organizing their buildings, grow renter power, and build community. We'll drop the links to sign up for the email list in the chat, and we welcome anyone who would like to come. Both meetings are hybrid. And next, I'm going to jump into a few events that are going on in the community. Saturday, March 30th from 12 to 4 p.m. at the Rainier Community Center, 4600 38th Ave South, the Community Health and Wellness Fair presented by Marvin Thomas Memorial, the YMCA, Holistic Coalition, and CompuKids Worldwide. There'll be giveaways, food, live performances, fresh produce, nutrition education, healthcare providers, food demos, and more. On Saturday, April 6th, a time to be determined, and it will be virtual. Share the City's Organizing Collective presents Seattle Comp Plan 101 and work parties. Come learn about the comp plan and join the work party discussion and comment sessions. Wednesday, April 10th from 3 to 4:45 online via Zoom. Solid Ground presents Rent Smart, fees and deposits. Have you ever been charged a fee by your landlord and you're not sure why? Is it even legal? Or have you vacated from a rental and you didn't get your deposit back? Join this webinar from Solid Ground tenant counselors and legal advisors to discuss which fees landlords are permitted to impose and which ones are illegal. Learn about deposits when applying for a new rental and how to go about getting your deposit back when you move out. A visiting attorney from the Tenant Law Center will also be on hand to help with answering some questions. Thursday, April 11th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. at El Centro de la Raza, room 311, for Roberto Maestas Digital Literacy Lab, or online via Zoom, the Seattle Renter Organizing Council meeting. Join us for April Seattle Renter Organizing Council meeting, where we will continue to work on the discussion of how to keep the city on track for the Office of Rental Housing Standards Work Group and how we can show up for renters in Seattle during this time. Come help us advocate, organize, and educate. Excuse me. Monday, April 15th, the Transit Advisory Board applications are due. If you're interested in transportation issues, volunteers are needed for the Seattle Pedestrian Advisory Board, Bike Advisory Board, and Transit Advisory Board. The link to more information has been put in the chat. Wednesday, April 17th from 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. in person and on Zoom at El Centro de la Raza, room 311 in the Digital Literacy Lab is the Elder Renter Council meeting. Tuesday, April 23rd from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. online via Zoom is a Resident Action Project King County Regional Call. The aim of RAP is to build a statewide network of people who are directly impacted by housing and homelessness issues who are leading the charge for social change. Come gain organizing, advocacy, and policy skills by attending one of RAP's monthly regional Zoom meetings. They happen on the fourth Tuesday of every month at 5:30. Wednesday, April 24th, 6-8 p.m. online via Zoom will be the Seattle April Building Tenant Power Workshop, Understanding Your Civil Rights in Renting. Join B Seattle and speakers from the City of Seattle Office of Civil Rights to discuss civil rights protections and renting and more. On Thursday, April 25th at 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. in the Seattle Central Library, Level 8, Real Change News is partnering with the Seattle Public Library to commemorate the 10th anniversary of their portrait project with a new exhibit, Stories from the Street, Up Close with Real Change. For the last decade, artists from around the state contributed their talents to creating portraits of real change vendors. These portraits have been on display in several locations, including City Hall and UW. Now we're bringing them to the Central Library downtown. We're also unveiling a dozen new vendor portraits by local artists as part of this exhibit. In a city where folks experiencing poverty and homelessness are all too often ignored, dehumanized, and shamed, we invite you to break down these barriers and get to know the vendors past and present. There will be free refreshments Everyone is welcome. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to my illustrious co-director, Kate, as she delves into some of the things that are coming up for us as breakers in the city of Seattle in this next couple of years.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you everyone for being here. So I just want to outline part of the reason that we are so concerned and why we decided to put this workshop forward. And then we'll go over some of the protections that we've won in the last few years, and some of the risks we might see. And then we'll do an outline, like we'll share more about some of the new council members. And then Katie Wilson from the Transit Riders Union, who we've been working with on the Stay House, Stay Healthy Coalition to win some of these protections. The coalition has also won similar renter protections throughout King County over the last few years. Will be joining us to talk about the narrative that the small landlords are putting forward. And then we'll end with the call to action, as we usually do. So to start with, this is Council President Nelson's world, and we're just living in it. Just to get everyone off to the right start and set the tone. Council President Nelson published an op-ed in the Seattle Times on January 4th of this year. Dee is going to drop it in the chat, but I'm going to read a good chunk of it out loud right now. One, because it's behind a paywall, and two, because a lot of it is relevant content to why our concerns are so high. So the power of the council presidency lies primarily in the authority to refer legislation to a committee for a vote. Most of the legislation that goes through the process is routine and non-controversial. However, the past few years have seen a sharp uptick in policy setting council initiatives, many of which passed through committee review quickly with scant public input and came to a vote with minimal debate. We've seen the results: businesses ceasing operations or leaving town, small housing providers pulling their below market rate rentals off the market, and a police department hobbled by dangerously low staffing levels, to name just a few. Under my leadership, this council won't externalize our policy-making authority. We will consider perspectives from people on all sides of an issue. And before referring new policy legislation to committee, I'll confirm it has gone through a robust stakeholder process. Instead of catering to special interests, we'll focus on mission-critical work that's responsive to our constituents who are demanding faster progress on homelessness and public safety. That's on top of issues like graffiti and potholes and getting our fiscal house in order. According to a recent Seattle Metropolitan Chamber poll, 68% of voters do not trust the city to spend their tax dollars responsibly, and the council's approval ratings are at an all-time low. To build back public trust and drive results, we must also exert our oversight role more rigorously. In part, that means defining the specific outcomes we expect from service providers and measuring the performance of those investments on a regular basis. If they're not working, our response to the fentanyl crisis, for example, we must have the political will to reevaluate and change course if necessary. In addition, we must break our reliance on new revenue, taxes, to pay our bills. That's an unsustainable fix for the wrong problem. The real problem is spending. According to a recent report by the city's Revenue Stabilization Work Group, general fund-based revenues were nearly pre-pandemic levels in 2021, and they've been growing faster than inflation and population since 2017. Yet the council raised over $1 billion in new taxes in the last 3 years to fuel spending on new programs. Instead of jump-starting Seattle's recovery, hundreds of businesses closed or left downtown, taking those jobs elsewhere. We now face a $220 million per year, $220 million per year and growing general fund deficit, and our pressing task will be balancing the 2025-2026 biannual budget. There is no question that this council will face some very difficult choices, but we do have options. The good news is that we've got an incredibly accomplished and professionally diverse set of new members joining our ranks, and we'll need their fresh, common sense perspectives as we weigh our alternatives. My vision as council president boils down to good governance, which is the foundation of sound public policy. I believe that if we change the way we operate, starting with coming into work in person, Seattleites can expect to see a major reset in tone and direction at City Hall. And I apologize, I can't see the chat, so Dee, just interrupt me if needed. But I just want to acknowledge that was just major dog whistles all over. And for those of us who are working in housing justice, we can see the writing on the wall with this. So to start with, the concept, the idea of small housing providers pulling their below market rentals off the market. Katie is going to go into that a lot more, but that's most likely untrue. The idea of externalizing policymaking authority is confusing because most of these policies were brought from the public that they're serving to the council, and we worked together to push these forward. And so when she says catering to special interests, what she is talking about is catering to the interests of the people who don't have power otherwise. So that is the most marginalized community members. She has no interest in catering or caring about those of us who are most harmed by housing injustice. As far as the budget and accountability, they are calling for service providers to have measurable outcomes on things that are not measurable. I mean, some of them are. We definitely can track like how many people were talked to and things like that. But for many of these groups who are providing education or support services, it's hard to measure. For example, we know how many people attended this workshop. We know how many people receive our emails. So B Seattle is funded under a tenant services grant through the city, as are many other organizations, the Tenants Union, the Tenant Law Center, Solid Ground. There's a bunch of organizations who are funded to do this work. What is not measurable is how many people this information actually reaches. So how many people have been informed of their rights, if not directly through this, then indirectly through telling people about it. Like, people don't usually just leave a workshop with this information and keep it to themselves. This is a community that educates each other and teaches each other. And so it grows. And then when we're talking about things like outreach to unhoused people, that's getting harder and harder to track with the city's constant sweeping of encampments. There were over 900 last year. They are on pace to keep up that same rate this year. And so these things are not the majority of the city's spending. And that's where it gets really concerning, because while council is very focused on these things, they're not focused on the other things that cost a ton of money, such as like funding the police, when a lot of the crime and other types of issues could be solved through other means. Oh, sorry, it's thundering right now and I'm like trying to not get distracted. And so I'm gonna move on from just going through every single piece in this article. And you might be thinking, after like, this outline, like, she's only one person. We have nine council members. 6 of those council members are new to office. I will go into that in a little bit. Oh, we're not quite there yet. Sorry, Tanya. But so far, they've already voted to undo 20 out of 36 statements of legislative intent. So they're also known as SLIs. So in an article published in Publicola by Erica Barnett last week, she said that the council annually adopts SLIs and budget provisos to oversee the mayor's actions and ensure transparency in spending. These often require departments to report on progress or spending. So last year, the old council passed 36 SLIs. So last week they undid 20 of them, and that includes a directive to collect data on rents, unit size, and other information about rental units in the city. So Council President Nelson saying that, you know, small landlords are just taking their units off the market. That's probably not true. And also any like evidence of that, she actively shut down. So this move was led by Council President Nelson, but it was supported unanimously by the city council. And Erica Barnett said it's unusual and possibly unprecedented. Council President Nelson has also been imposing strict limits on public comment periods, which means that the public's opportunity to give the feedback that you know, she allegedly is doing and wants to hear from stakeholders is being taken away. Furthermore, and this may sound petty, but it's also worth noting, she hasn't responded to any of our requests to meet as the State House Stay Healthy Coalition. So she's kind of criticizing the work that has already been done, that we were involved in, and does not want to have a conversation about it. And so let's talk about the new council just pretty broadly. There's 6 new council members. 4 of the 6 council members were endorsed by Sarah Nelson. So when I say that this is Sarah Nelson's world and we're just living in it, sorry, I see. Sorry, Sally, I'm trying to get into the oh, sorry. So Sally asked in the chat if I could define slides if you're talking about something that the council does, not slides in the sense of the presentation. So I'm sorry, I probably didn't pronounce the difference enough. So I was talking about statements of legislative intent, SLI, and so they're kind of just referred to as slides overall. And I hope that clarifies that. So another reason that we are a little bit concerned is at the Housing and Human Services Committee meeting on February 28th, there was a presentation from the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections, SDCI, who enforces a majority of our landlord-tenant laws, and they fund tenant services. There were several landlords who called in to complain about tenant protections, which appeared to be a coordinated effort, and we expect that to be ongoing. And the committee members were asking, I would say, probing questions of SDCI, really pushing to find out like how much manpower it's taking and time to enforce the tenant protections that we have. They were really focused on EDRA. There were a lot of concerns that the city is funding right to counsel when there's also like state protections, really going after the funds at SDCI. And I don't want to like overly defend SDCI too much, but I know that their like response time, and they do triage their calls and focus on the ones that are hazardous to life, but their response time at this point is like an average of like nearly 2 months. They do not have the manpower to stay on top of this. And there was just talk about streamlining it, which is a really difficult thing to do when honestly, like, we're in a housing crisis. They are being overwhelmed, and those of us who are funded by the tenant services grant are doing outreach, educating renters on their rights, but we can't solve their problems. Often it requires code enforcement, and so we can refer them to the city, but we often cannot get the landlord to fix code violations or stop breaking the law on our own. And so until landlords are accountable for that, STCI is going to continue getting a ton of calls because we are in a housing crisis. So let's go into the tenant protections that we have won over the last few years. This is not the entire list, but it's a majority of the protections, and it excludes protections that were specific to the pandemic that have now passed. So for the first in time ordinance, landlords are required to offer a rental agreement to the first qualified applicant who provides a completed application. They must inform tenants about the right to request additional time where needed, such as translation for reasonable accommodation for disability. It needs to have the date and time stamped on applications in order received. They must screen applications in chronological order, one at a time. They need to give a minimum of 72 hours to provide additional information for an otherwise complete application. And they need to provide 48 hours for a response to an offer of a rental agreement. So this was the first legislation of its kind in the country, and it increases fair access to housing. And it's worth noting that this legislation was supported by then council member Bruce Harrell, and it is enforced by the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, not SDCI. And it excludes people who are living in ADUs, like backyard cottages, basement apartments, or mother-in-laws, as well as roommates if the owner lives on site. There was a lawsuit that was so the ordinance was originally overturned by the King County Court, and the city appealed it. And it ultimately was unanimously upheld by the Washington State Supreme Court. So there's some concern about getting it overturned. The other concern is that it will be watered down to exempt all small landlords. And Katie can probably go into later on how it's hard to even identify whether or not a landlord is actually a small landlord. When I was a member of the small landlord stakeholder group back in, I think it was 2021 or 2022, there was one participant who suggested that it just be limited by property size, because landlords have a stake in so many properties, it's just really hard to tell who actually owns it. So anyway, that would leave a lot of people uncovered by this, and in a market where it's really competitive finding affordable housing, this is a protection that really covers a lot of people. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Cap on move-in costs and move-in cost installments. So the security deposit and fees combined cannot equal more than 1 month's rent. Fees can only be charged for screening and or cleaning and cannot exceed 10% of the first full month's rent. The landlord can't profit from the screening fee. Pet deposits are limited to a maximum of 25% of 1 month's rent. Service animals are exempt, and renters have a right to pay move-in costs, last month's rent, and pet deposits in installments. The payment plan required by the city for a 6 month plus lease is 6 consecutive and equal payments. For 30 days to 6 month lease, 4 consecutive and equal payments. And for month-to-month leases, 2 equal installments, except for pet deposits, which can be made in 3 equal monthly installments. So this legislation was supported by then council member Bruce Harrell. And there was a lawsuit, the Rental Housing Association versus the City of Seattle, and the ordinance was upheld by King County Superior Court. Again, there's concern about this being overturned completely, or small landlords being exempt. This is something that we need to pay attention to. And the next protection is the Fair Chance Housing Ordinance. It protects discrimination in housing against renters with arrest records, conviction records, or criminal history. There are some exceptions. If a landlord finds if a landlord or any person finds information about a prospective adult occupant or adult tenant on a sex offender registry, there must be a legitimate business reason analysis done before taking any adverse action, sorry. And then for federally assisted housing, it's subject to federal regulations that do require denial of tenancy, including but not limited to when a member of the household is subject to a lifetime sex offender registration requirement under a state sex offender registration program, and or they were convicted of manufacture or production of methamphetamine on the premises of federally assisted housing. Recently, the 9th U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that prohibition against asking about criminal history is overly broad and unconstitutional. However, it did uphold prohibition on taking adverse action against a tenant, and that would be something like refusing to rent to them based on their record. As with some of the previous protections, ADUs, like backyard cottages, and mother-in-laws and roommates are exempt. This is something that I feel I often hear. Again, Katie will go into this a little bit more, but the small landlords have mentioned a lot that they want to be able to determine who lives in the housing that they own. But going against fair chance housing is inherently discriminatory. Okay, next slide, please. So the roommate ordinance allows for the addition of immediate family members and or one non-family roommate to the lease. So immediate family is broadly defined. It includes spouses, domestic partners, former spouses, former domestic partners, adult persons related by marriage, siblings, persons 16 years of age or older who are presently residing together or who have resided together in the past and who have had a dating relationship, and persons who have a parent-child relationship, including parents, step-parents, grandparents, adoptive parents, guardians, foster parents, or custodians of minors. It also includes immediate family of the additional roommate, as long as the additional people do not exceed the legal occupancy standards. So the landlord can screen the new household member using the same screening criteria that was originally used in the rental application. So family and non-family can be screened. However, immediate family members cannot be denied occupancy based on the screening, and non-family members can if they don't meet the screening that was originally applied. And so except for the screening fee, no other move-in charges can be applied to the added household member, and all original terms of the rental agreement remain the same. This was supported by then council member Bruce Harrell.
Hey, we've had a question about what constitutes a small landlord. I know it's one of your favorite questions to answer. I was going to answer it in the chat, but I figured it would be much better coming from you.
Yes, and I laughed because it's really hard to fine because the city doesn't really track ownership. And so actually I don't have an answer for that. Small landlords, sometimes they describe themselves as owning 10 or fewer units. I think that like the city like very, very loosely defines it as owning 4 or fewer units. But there is no like standard definition. And it's also pretty much impossible to know how many units a landlord actually owns because they are often placed under LLCs. And I see Christina has a hand raised. Go ahead, Christina.
How does it, if I have caregivers that are going to live with me, how does that then, because that's always a confusing question and I've never really got a good answer about that.
So this is actually a great time for me to say I am not a lawyer. So I can't, like, please don't take anything that I'm saying as like definitive. I'm, you know, legal stuff. This is just informative. However,
I don't think they know either.
I would think that a caregiver would likely be considered non-family, so they could still potentially be screened and denied. However, if that were the case, I believe that you could file for a reasonable accommodation that would cover that, and if that were denied, you could go through the Seattle Office for Civil Rights. Okay.
Can I offer a quick comment on the small landlord thing?
Yes, go ahead. Right ahead, Tom.
So you have to understand, like, essentially, this is a political term.
Mhm.
The reason that it's so hard to come up with a definition is because this thing is a basically you're supposed to feel sorry for people that own only a few units. There's no actual evidence. First of all, the small landlords are being driven out, except by large landlords who actually buy properties up and then tear an older building down and erect a new building. That's really the only actual documented way in which small landlords get forced out. But basically, you know, the situation is that Sarah Nelson and all her bosom buddies can't actually come into the city council and say, we love landlords, because it doesn't sound good. So instead, they say, well, gee, you know, all these small landlords are being so put upon. So there's no definition deliberately. It's a political term, and that's all it is. And, you know, we should just recognize that fact. Thanks.
I'm with you, Tom. And Katie's going to go more into that in a little bit. As for the the narrative that is being told, so it's being both told to city council and being put out by city council. And then even on a larger level, you hear the term like mom and pop landlord, but you know, it's not reflective of most people's parents. There was actually a small landlord who put out a video criticizing me and my organizing skills, and somebody commented in the video like, you know, she should just have to be a small landlord. And I thought, oh my God, I would love to be able to afford not one but multiple properties. Wow, I agree with you. But anyway, let's move on. Let's move on to the winter eviction ban. So this is actually an ordinance that exists to protect vulnerable renters in Seattle from being made homeless during the coldest weather months of the year. So between December 1st and March 1st, low to moderate income households can rely on this as a defense to eviction, except for the following. If the landlord owns 4 or few rental units within the city of Seattle. So that's where I was getting the number 4 from, because this is one of the only places that it is defined. The landlord or a member of their immediate family needs to occupy the rental unit. The owner wishes to sell the rental unit. The city requires the owner to discontinue renting the unit for various reasons. In some cases, the displaced tenants are paid relocation assistance. Or the owner issues a 3-day notice to quit for criminal activity, nuisance, or waste, or for posing an imminent threat to health and safety. For these purposes, moderate income is defined as the area median income. So this legislation was supported by current council members Tammy Morales and Dan Strauss. And there was a lawsuit, the Rental Housing Association versus the city of Seattle. And they also had some other landlords who were tied into that lawsuit. So the lawsuit was for this ordinance and 2 others that were connected to the COVID-19 state of emergency. One prohibiting a landlord from evicting tenants for non-payment of rent for 6 months after the end of the COVID-19 eviction moratorium, and one requiring the landlord to accept installment payments of unpaid rent for a certain period of time after the end of the civil emergency. So the King County Court concluded that a provision banning the accrual of interest on unpaid rent during the civil emergency and for 1 year thereafter was preempted by state law, but it upheld the remaining provisions of the 3 challenged ordinances. So the eviction moratorium is still in place. And then a Washington State Court of Appeals upheld the winter eviction ban, but struck down the 6-month rule because of a procedural difference. Okay. Prohibited use of COVID-19 related eviction history. So this prohibits adverse action against a prospective or existing tenant or occupant or a member of the tenant or occupant's household based on any eviction history between March 1st, 2020 and April 30th, 2020. It excludes evictions for waste, nuisance, or posing an imminent threat to health and safety. And it was supported by current council members Tammy Morales and Dan Strauss. So there is a state law that's similar, but it only covers the eviction history between March 1st, 2020 and December 31st, 2021, which is 6 months after the statewide eviction moratorium ended. The cities went longer. So there is some concern that the city will water this down to match the state. But this one is more robust and protects more people. And the next slide, please. This is kind of an important one, even though it sounds small, and it's just cause protections for fixed term. Well, they're all important for fixed term lease renewals. So this requires a landlord to give the tenant the right of first refusal of a new tenancy when the tenant is coming to the end of an existing fixed term lease, unless the landlord has just cause to decline offering the new tenancy, or if the fixed term tenancy automatically converts to month. So the landlord is required to make the offer between 60 and 90 days before expiration of the existing lease, and the tenant has 30 days to accept or decline the offer. So the landlord must comply with the requirements of this ordinance before they are required to comply with requirements to make first in time tenancy decisions. So this is really important because before this was passed, landlords often would use the end of a fixed term lease to kick a tenant out. So they didn't have to go through the formal eviction process, and they didn't have just cause, which obviously people who are typically victims of discrimination were more often suffering from that. Sorry, I just lost my spot. And also, like, moving is so expensive. We can't afford to move every single year on the whims of a landlord. So if this is your home, they need to have just cause to make you leave. Councilmember Tammy Morales was one of the sponsors of this legislation, and Councilmember Strauss, who was on council at this time, but was not present for the vote. Okay, next slide, please. The school year eviction defense ordinance provides a defense to eviction for households with students, daycare to high school, educators, or educational support staff during the Seattle School District calendar year. So there are some exceptions. The owner or their immediate family needs to occupy the rental unit. The city requires the owner to discontinue renting the unit. The city requires an owner to reduce the number of tenants in a unit, or the owner issues a 3-day notice to quit for criminal activity, nuisance or waste, or posing an imminent threat to health and safety. Oh, I left a blank thing on the slide. There actually isn't a similar state law. I was copy pasting from a previous slide and I missed it. I'm sorry about that. So we'll just hop to the next slide. Thank you. Right to counsel. So any tenant residing in the city of Seattle who is named in an unlawful detainer suit, or eviction suit, and does not have the ability to pay the cost of counsel over representation has the right to legal counsel free of charge. So the city defines indigent as a person who at any stage of an unlawful detainer suit is unable to pay the cost of counsel over representation in the unlawful detainer suit because their available funds are insufficient to retain counsel. So the state law is much more prohibitive. To be defined as indigent and qualify for free legal counsel, a person needs to be receiving one of the following types of public assistance: temporary assistance for needy families, aged, blind, or disabled assistance benefits, medical care services under RCW 740935, pregnant women assistance benefits, poverty-related veterans benefits, food stamps or food stamp benefits transferred electronically, refugee resettlement benefits, Medicaid or supplemental security income, or receiving an annual income after taxes of 200% or less of the currently federally established poverty level. So for context, for a single person household in 2024, that's $30,120 per year. And for a 2-person household, that's $40,880 per year. And so you can see, especially in a city like Seattle, where the cost of living is so high, an emergency could put you in a position where you cannot pay for representation and cannot pay your rent or whatever other issue there is, but you still exceed that income threshold. So this being watered down to the state level would be dangerous and would lead to many more evictions. Next slide, please. Uh, 180-day notice of rent increase. This requires landlords to provide a minimum of 180 days prior written notice to tenants whenever the housing costs to be charged to the tenant are to increase. So this is intended to give tenants adequate time to evaluate their finances and search for other housing that meets their needs. And it was supported by council members Tammy Morales and Dan Strauss. Next slide. Economic relocation displacement assistance, also known as EDRA. So tenants earning 80% or less of Seattle's area median income that give notice to vacate after receiving a notice of a rent increase of 10% or more, or of less than 10% where the cumulative effect for the household's tenancy is 10% or more, are eligible to apply for financial assistance up to 3 times the current monthly housing costs. The city processes the tenant applications and advances payment, and the landlord reimburses the city. And this was supported by council members Tammy Morales and Dan Strauss. I see that there is a hand raised. Go ahead and unmute. Oh, you're still muted. I see you talking.
Sorry, Kate. On that last slide, my question was what you said after a 10% increase or a cumulative effect of 10, if it's less than 10%. Can you explain what you meant by those numbers?
Sure. So a landlord can give more than one increase per year, or they can issue like an increase, like here's your increased rent if you renew your tenancy, and then the cost to go month to month is increased a different amount. So it's cumulative as long as it adds up to 10% or more from the original rent that you were paying within that 12-month period. It would still qualify. So if you get like 2 rent increases that year, and maybe neither of them was 10% by itself, but combined they were, then you would still qualify.
Okay, thank you.
Clear. Next slide, please. The $10 per month cap on late fees and the ban on notice delivery fees. So this limits late rent fees to $10 per month and prohibits landlords from charging other fees associated with late payment of rent or fees for the issuance of notices. So this legislation just passed last year, and it was supported by council members Morales and Strauss. It's worth noting that current council president Sarah Nelson opposed this, and the legislation was returned unsigned by Mayor Harrell. So this could be at higher risk, because we know that the current people in power did not agree with this decision. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I did just like a wide analysis on some of the new council members. So we'll go through them. I just as a broad overview, I looked at council members Saka, Rivera, Moore, Kettle. You know, I'm already like going through it. Why am I forgetting someone? I'm sorry.
Tanya Wu.
I skipped Councilmember Wu because she was appointed to her seat, and while she did run a campaign last year, it was only in District 2 and a citywide campaign and a statewide campaign often, or sorry, a citywide campaign and a district-wide campaign often look different. They get different endorsements and different funding, and there's a different strategy. So because I did a deep dive on these, we'll just go into them and I can explain. So council member, and the context of this is that we need to know a little bit about who we're dealing with, and how to best communicate with them and who else might be in their ear. So we'll start with Councilmember Saka. He lives in District 1, which is West Seattle, South Park, Georgetown, Pioneer Square. And he received endorsements from many public servants. I'm not going to read all of them out loud, but some of the notable ones that are still in power: Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell, current Seattle President Sarah Nelson, council members at the time, the former president Deborah Juarez, council member Alex Peterson, and then a whole bunch of former Seattle City Council members, as well as a variety of other public servants. And if you're familiar with you know, other bodies of government and how others work, it seems to have a variety of perspectives. There are a lot of more conservative people on here, but there's also some more progressive people, like Grimai Zahale, who is a King County Council member, and Chapala Street, the state representative for the 37th Legislative District, who is a landlord, but also advocated at a state level for rent stabilization. So it's just, you know, to get a broad picture of who we're talking to. And can you go to the next slide, please, Tanya? He also received endorsements from some unions and other organizations, including the 34th Legislative District Democrats, the Affordable Housing Council of the Master Builders Association of King and Snohomish Counties. And just overall, if you look and see who is supporting this. So, and I'm not going to read all of his or all of everyone's, but just when you look at the screen, just evaluate like who might be a stakeholder in this. So, if they have a lot of union support, that means like workers support. If the unions are in constructions or they're building trades, that would impact the type of work that they are going to be advocating for within the city. And then like what the overall political tone is of these various endorsements, both from the public servants and from the unions and organizations. And then just a little bit of context for Councilmember Saka. He actually, on his campaign website, which has been taken down, but we looked at it anyway. He did speak a little bit about where he stands on some housing issues. So I'm going to read just a couple quick statements from him. He said, as the son of a Nigerian immigrant father who was a frontline warehouse worker, I experienced living in public and low-income housing growing up. Everyone deserves safe, quality, affordable housing in a thriving community. A severe lack of housing for people at all income levels means that those at the bottom are suffering the most and being pushed out of the city. That's an important statement, and one to keep in mind when you are engaging with him. And then there's another one. As a former foster kid, I know what it's like to be completely uprooted and swept away. We must do better for our unhoused neighbors. Sadly, the homelessness crisis in our city has turned into a total humanitarian catastrophe. It is our moral imperative to take urgent action now. Addressing homelessness requires navigating a complex web of intertwined issues. However, it's evident that the primary contributors to the escalating homelessness population are housing instability, limited access to crucial services, and shortcomings in the response system's efficacy. As a city council member, my unwavering commitment rests on enhancing housing stability, fostering accessible service provision, and ensuring systemic outcomes that actively prevent and reduce homelessness. So while he didn't explicitly mention any of the renter protections that we listed, these are things that ensure systemic outcomes that actively prevent and reduce homelessness. So these are things to keep in mind when you're talking to him. And the other thing that you want to keep in mind when you are talking to any council member, if you go to the next slide, please, Tanya, is who funded their campaign. And so this is a very small window into who funded council member Saka's campaign. And I did this for several of the other council members, which we'll be sharing. And this is all public record. You can look up every single person who donated to any campaign. And so you can take a look. But these are some of the ones that stood out to me. He had a good chunk of real estate brokers, and developers. It's worth noting Carl Haglund, who is a notorious landlord here in Seattle. There was actually a law passed requiring landlords or actually prohibiting landlords from raising the rent when their units are do not meet the living standard conditions. That was passed because of him excessively raising rent on substandard units. It's known as the Carl Hagelin Law or the Slumlord Law. So it's important to note that he's donating to this campaign. If you'll look, you'll also see some the Washington Multifamily Housing Association. That's an important campaign contributor. And going through his campaign contributions, and this is kind of unsurprising, but it's worth noting that he had large investments from lawyers, and he himself is a lawyer. He grew up in the Seattle area, went to school at Kent Meridian, which is near where I used to live. And so that is his network. So it's not unsurprising, but that does like lead into his perspective. The other just notable fact about him is that he is a father of 3 living in West Seattle, and his 3 kids attend Seattle public schools. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the next person that we are going to discuss is Councilmember Hollingsworth in District 3, which is Central Seattle, including Eastlake, Montlake, Madison Park, Capitol Hill, First Hill, Leschi, and the Central District. Councilmember Hollingsworth was born and raised in the Central District, and she still lives there with her wife and her dog. Her family has been there since the 1940s. She has a master's degree in education from UW. She spent 3 seasons at Seattle University as an assistant women's basketball coach. And then in 2014, she joined Hollingsworth Farms, a family-owned and operated cannabis company. Her family, and she helped to grow and manage one of Washington's few independent Black-owned cannabis operations. So let's take a look at her endorsements from public servants. It includes the current mayor of Seattle, and then a bunch of other former council members. And as you can see, this tends to lean slightly conservative, but not quite as conservative as Councilmember Saka, with some progressives on there, including, as I noted with Councilmember Saka, Gurmai Zahale, King County Council member. And then next slide, please. She had strong support from unions and community organizations. So you can take a look at this. She has pretty decent support from labor. Let's go to the next slide, please. And then she had some interesting standout campaign donations as well, including small landlords, a lot of real estate developers. It's worth noting that Council President Sarah Nelson, while she did not endorse her, she did donate to this campaign. And so just worth keeping in mind. As far as Councilmember Hollingsworth, her opinions on housing. When she was asked about rent control, which is kind of like a dividing line, or rent stabilization, she told the Capitol Hill Seattle blog she only wants to focus on straightforward elements like streamlining the permitting process, addressing the need for the missing middle programs, including those that can help people age in place by adding ADUs, triplexes, and duplexes, and supporting the city's new Seattle social housing developer with resources for workforce housing to start developing and implementing the proof of concept. She also said she would support monthly vouchers to help alleviate the financial burden with temporary rental assistance for families. She didn't really touch on existing renter protections or how they protect people and prevent displacement. But it is worth noting that she said that she would support a separate office of rental housing standards that would provide robust enforcement of tenant protections. She said this a couple times, both in a public forum with all of the candidates before the primary, and then again in an endorsement interview with the Washington Community Action Network. Okay, next slide, please. Maritza Rivera covers District 4, which is Bryant, Laurelhurst, Maple Leaf, Ravenna, Roosevelt, Sandpoint, the U District, View Ridge, Wallingford, Wedgwood, and Windermere. The public servants that endorsed her, it's a smaller list, but noteworthy: Bruce Harrell, Sarah Nelson, Bob Ferguson, the Washington Attorney General, who is going to be running for governor, as well as former council members, former senator, and a former candidate. She didn't receive as many endorsements from unions and organizations, but she still has a few of them. And let's go to the standout campaign donations. So again, a lot of investments from real estate and developers and capital management, which can often be part of developing. I didn't really list them out, but there was something unusual. And that and you can see Carl Haglund, notorious slumlord, was one of her campaign donors. Yes, somebody commented, Jenny Durkin, the former Seattle mayor. And the multifamily housing association. These are just like, you have to consider like who is making sure that they're elected, who is in their ear when looking at these standout campaign donations. And there was a question, Saul Villarreal, wasn't he McGinn campaign manager? I am not aware that could be right. But if anyone knows, please feel free to answer that in the chat.
Sorry, I can answer it. I'm the person who answered asked the question. Yeah, 4 years outreach and communications work in the mayor's office for former mayor Mike McGinn, but he worked on the McGinn campaign too. Anyway, that's surprising that he would then support Maritza Rivera politically. Seems a departure.
Can you speak more to that?
Well, Mike McGinn, he was former mayor of Seattle. Mm-hmm. And considered progressive, as far as I know. The political consultant Robert Cruikshank was aligned with McGinn, and for that matter, Mike O'Brien, both considered progressive, both anathema or considered opposites of a political establishment that rotates around Sarah Nelson, Heidi Wills, Pete Hanning, who ran. Okay. So just to see Sol in there, who was so enthusiastic to get Mike elected, and once he did, worked on a progressive platform, to see him endorse Maritza. He was out of politics as far as I could tell, but doing this puts him, back in, and he's he's on a standout campaign donations, and standout maybe because of his political affiliations previous, and then maybe because he's a highly successful broker. I really don't know him as a player politically anymore, and I was surprised to see him Maritz's endorsee.
So, Katie also commented in the chat that she knows Saul, and he is fairly progressive. And you know, several of these are pretty progressive. Like if you go through her campaign list, it like there are some surprises. She hasn't really spoken very much on where she stands, specifically with tenant issues. Her platform was really heavily rooted in public safety. I'm sorry, my laptop just started jumping around, so I lost my spot, but I did have some other notes on this. Just give me 1 second. From the website, the city's website, she is committed to bringing both accountability and civility back to City Hall. She says our city programs should be consistently delivering their intended results with robust systems in place to measure progress and outcomes. If programs don't deliver, then we must act and make the necessary changes to meet goals. To me, that is kind of red flag language. But it really depends on how she is going to define that, and who is going to be held accountable. So part of that is community reaching out to her and having like civil conversations. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we reach the call to action, but that's worth noting that like there are areas where all of these council members can be nudged. And it's just, you have to find those spots and find common ground with them. Can we go to the next slide, please? So Councilmember Kathy Moore represents District 5. That's North Seattle, including Bitter Lake, Haller Lake, Pinehurst, Lake City, Broadview, Licton Springs, North Beach, Crown Hill, Greenwood, Maple Leaf, Northgate, and Meadowbrook. So it's worth noting that Councilmember Moore is the chair of the Housing and Human Services Committee that will likely deal with any legislation that is brought forward to get more tenant protections or overturn tenant protections. So this is an especially important relationship to build. Councilmember Moore is a lifelong Seattleite, a North End resident. She's a former King County Superior Court judge and a former Seattle public defender. So she has a pretty robust list of public servants who endorsed her, including the current Seattle mayor, the former council president, and 3 of her opponents for this race. Can we go to the next slide with the unions and organization? So this was impressive. She by far had the highest number of unions and organizations that endorsed her. In fact, I couldn't actually fit all of them onto the one slide, so I included some of the most relevant ones. And of course, she, like everyone, all of the new council members, was endorsed by the Seattle Times. But this is a pretty strong union support, higher than any of the other new council members. And she also has spoken favorably about potentially turning the Jackson golf course into public housing, which is an extremely progressive take, honestly, for that neighborhood. So there are areas where potentially she can be moved on renters' rights, but she hasn't spoken, to my knowledge, explicitly about how important they are, or how they need to be defended. So let's take a look at her campaign donations. Okay. Right away, what pops out? Carl Haglund, notorious slumlord, also donated to her campaign. But she has pretty strong support from labor through donations as well. The other thing that stood out was that she received funds from Marilyn Yim, who is a small landlord who sued the city regarding several renter protections. Again, that's a red flag that we need to be aware of. And then something else that stood out to me that I found interesting was she received funds from Toyota of Lake City, and I didn't include it, but also from somebody who worked at a local car dealership. And so there are a lot of car dealerships in District 5. And so when we think about transit-oriented development and, you know, where we're building housing and how people access the city, it is worth keeping in mind that there is that vested interest on that end. Okay. And I think we can go to the next slide. Council member Robert Kettle, he was known by Bob on the campaign trail, but all of the recent stuff on the city website refer to him as Robert. So I haven't met him yet. I'm not sure what he likes to be called in person, so we're just going with Robert. But that might have been the Bob-Rob confusion with Rob Saka. So he is the council member for District 7, which is the city's fastest growing district. That covers Magnolia, Queen Anne, Uptown, Westlake, Interbay, Eastlake, South Lake Union, Belltown, and Downtown. He defeated incumbent Andrew Lewis to get this position. He has said that he has a dedicated focus on our district's and city's public safety, reducing the permissive environment, expanding public health, and securing the future of the Port of Seattle to keep it a working, viable port for the next 100 years. So he has some notable public servants who endorsed him. One that is very notable is the current Seattle City Attorney, Ann Davison, who is known to be very conservative. He also has endorsements from Sarah Nelson, former council president Deborah Juarez, Alex Peterson, folks who are on the more progressive scale as far as the city government goes. He also has a few endorsements from unions and organizations. Not a ton. I think the noteworthy one is he's the only one who was strongly aligned with the Downtown Seattle Association. So that's business interests. So we can go to the standout campaign donations. So again, Carl Haglund donated money to him. The thing that was very noteworthy with his donations was that there were significantly more donations appearingly from, just an eyeball analysis from investors. So capital management, real estate developers. Like I said, there was a lot of investment in this election period from those groups, but he received a wider amount of those from more organizations and more individuals. And that is going to be deeply influencing his role here. So that covers all of the new council members except for council member Tanya Wu. As I noted earlier, I left her out of this analysis because one, it was super time consuming to go through all of these, and I did read through her stuff. Nothing stood out as like, this is unique to her as far as who is donating to her campaign. But the other thing that is worth mentioning was that her campaign was for the City Council District 2 position, which is held by the incumbent Tammy Morales. It was not focused on a citywide campaign. So she was appointed to this position by the Seattle City Council and came with Council President Nelson's endorsement, who also did endorse her original campaign for District 2. In fact, she showed up to a campaign event while she was supposed to be at a council meeting. I still remember that. So this kind of gives you like a broad overview of the new council members and how we might be interacting with them. And with that, I'm going to ask Tanya to stop screen sharing, and I will hand it over to Katie Wilson. Katie is the secretary for the Transit Writers Union. She's been bottom lining the Stay Healthy Coalition, and she is just like an absolutely incredible community organizer who I constantly look to for insight and guidance. So I'm really excited to have her here with us. And she's going to be talking about the small landlord narrative.
Thank you, Kate, and great to see everyone. And that was actually a really interesting dive into council member donations and everything. I have thank you for doing that deep dive, Kate. So yeah, so I'm going to say a few words about kind of the small landlord narratives that get used to argue against renter protections and or to argue that small landlords should be exempted from them. There's a few different narratives that you'll hear. Sometimes small landlords try to play the victim and make you feel sorry for them, like, poor me, small landlord, like I need the revenue from this rental property to pay for my retirement or, you know, my mother's care or, you know, this, that, or the other thing. So sometimes you'll hear some of that. I think that the landlords have realized that that line of argument doesn't work that well. Like if you're a landlord, you know, I think like Kate mentioned earlier, you know, you own not only your own house, but at least one other, you know, $1 million+ property as well. And so when we're, you know, looking at the housing insecurity that renters face and the poverty that renters face, it's a little bit hard to argue that we should just feel really sorry for the economic situation of the small landlord. You know, they'll talk about how I need to pay my mortgage and, you know, this, that, and the other thing. So I think the more effective line that some of the landlord lobby groups and small landlords have landed upon is that we should care about small landlords because of what they do for renters. And that if we don't have and support small landlords and do what they want, then the situation is going to be worse, not for the landlord, but for the renter. And so I think one argument along those lines that you'll hear is that with all of these regulations, with the first in time law, with the criminal background check law, landlords are unable to work with their tenants, right? They like to have the small landlords like to have the personal touch where, you know, they see someone in need who needs a second chance and they want to give it to them. But now because of all these rules about, you know, first in time and everything, they don't have that freedom. Everything has to be by the book. And so also in order to protect themselves, you know, for example, they're having to raise their credit check requirement or something like that, right? So you'll hear these arguments that they're making changes to the way they operate as landlords that make it worse for renters because of all these rules. So that's another line of argument that you'll hear. And then I think the one that we've seen used most loudly over the past years, especially during the pandemic, is that we should care about small landlords and we shouldn't make them follow all these rules because they're just getting out of the market. They can't handle it, right? They're selling their rental properties, and they're not going to be landlords anymore, right? They're going to turn them into Airbnbs, or they're going to just sell them off, and they're going to be developed into townhomes or something. And then there's not going to be these single family homes, small rental properties for renters to live in at all. So we're actually losing rental housing stock because the city is passing all of these onerous renter protections. So that's a narrative that has been around for quite a long time. And I know it kind of became, I think, politically influential in 2018 when there was a study, and I can find a link here and put it in the chat. There was a study that was done by a team at the University of Washington, kind of at the request of the city. I think this is the right one. And it basically looked at a few of the renter protection laws, including first in time, including the fair chance housing law, and I think the move-in fee cap law. And it included a fairly large survey of landlords. And the landlords, the small landlords especially, they really overwhelmingly, I think it was 40% of the landlords who responded to the survey said that they had either sold or were planning to sell their properties because of these laws. So, I mean, that's just astounding numbers. And so, that did not scare the council at that point into making changes. But then during the pandemic, when there were eviction moratoriums, when Be Seattle and other organizations in Stay House, Stay Healthy Coalition were fighting for stronger renter protection laws, both emergency and permanent, that narrative popped up again, big time. And it was the Rental Housing Association, some of the other landlord groups basically got data from SDCI that they said, purporting to show that there were fewer and fewer rental properties, especially small rental properties, because registrations with SDCI had just plummeted. Now, it turns out the numbers didn't actually say what they thought they said, right? There was the city had basically stopped requiring doing any kind of enforcement or requiring landlords to register. So there was just a ton of fall off in registration, not because the properties weren't rental properties anymore, but just because the landlords hadn't re-registered. But they just took these numbers and they, put out press releases. They got news articles placed which said, "Oh, Seattle's losing thousands of units, and it's because of these laws." And I mean, the other thing is that, okay, even if it were true that there was a big loss of units at that time, it was during the pandemic, right? This was an extraordinary circumstance. This doesn't reflect the permanent renter protections that are in place. So that narrative has continued, and I think the most kind of useful recent thing that's happened is that the same team at the UW who did that earlier survey of the landlords, the guy who had kind of led that study, his name is Kyle Crowder at the UW, he was kind of scratching his head and saying, really, 40%? And so they they actually dug into property sale records. So they looked at property sales of small rental properties that took place before that first in time and fair chance housing laws were passed and after it was implemented. And basically they were able to use various kind of markers. I don't know all the details of how they did the data analysis, but to determine which single family homes were rental properties. And so they looked at sales of small rental properties in the city of Seattle, and then outside of the city of Seattle, in areas that did not have those same renter protections, both before and after those laws were implemented, and basically found no difference. And so the conclusion there is that those laws played no significant difference in the sales of small rental properties. So the conclusion is, don't believe what the landlords say. So if there's one thing to take away from that study, and let me see, I did a little write-up of it for Publicola, so I'm going to put a link to that in the chat. So yeah, and I mean, it's been hard, I think, to combat that narrative because there hasn't been data, there hasn't been a study, but now there is. So that's really useful. That doesn't mean that the council members are going to immediately believe it. I think there's still like there was a recent audit of the rental housing program, or the rental registration program, that again included a landlord survey, and it was similarly just like really high percentages saying that they were getting out of the market because of Seattle's laws. And you have to also understand how these surveys were done, right? So the Rental Housing Association, Seattle Grassroots Landlords, right? These landlord groups were asked to help promote these surveys. So you can bet that when they shared these surveys with their members, with their constituencies, they were not just saying like, oh, here's a survey you might want to take, right? Like presumably they were also including some suggestions as to the message that the people should be sending in their survey responses. So yeah, and I guess the other thing that I'll say, and I know that there was some discussion of this already, I think Kate and Tom both kind of made some of this point, that it's really important not to exempt small landlords from these protections. And there's a number of reasons why. One of them is that it is really hard to know what a small landlord is. So even if you decide on a definition like owns 4 or fewer units, as a tenant and even as the city, there's really no way for you to know how many units a landlord owns. And I actually learned this recently in the course of writing a couple of articles for Publicola about the nightmare tenant stories that have been circulating. So you might have seen one about this landlord, Jason Roth, whose tenant has just been staying there forever and not paying rent, and the landlord became homeless and had to sleep in his van. Well, as I was doing digging for that story and I looked up the property record for that house, it's owned by an LLC. And the landlord is actually not even listed as a governor of the LLC. It's his father that's listed there. And I subsequently learned, I thought that meant like, oh, well, okay, his dad owns the property, right? I subsequently learned that he is the landlord, but he's listed as such. He's listed as the sole member of the LLC in an operating agreement, which does not have to be disclosed in Washington state. So these LLCs can have operating agreements where the landlord's listed in there as the one who has like the financial interest and who is responsible for like overseeing the property. But like that's not anywhere on the Secretary of State website. That is not a public document. So you really just have no way of knowing as a tenant, if you live in a house, whether your landlord owns just that property or 50 properties or 100 properties, right? You just don't know. And this is actually the same thing with you might have seen recently, this landlord protest in Bellevue, where another landlord called a protest in front of his tenant's house because he hasn't paid in a long time. And similarly, if you look up that LLC, that landlord's not listed. It's an LLC. That landlord's not listed as a governor. It's some other guy who's listed as a governor. So again, his status as the landlord is totally not a matter of public record. So that's one really good reason not to try to exempt small landlords. The other, of course, is that small landlords are not necessarily good landlords, right? Some of the worst and most abusive and discriminatory and, et cetera, behavior can come from small landlords because you're just dealing with a person and their personality might be really crappy. And so it's just very important to make sure that all renters have these protections, no matter how many units their landlord owns. So maybe I'll stop there. And Kate, you can fill in if there's things that you wanted me to say that I didn't say.
No, I think that was a really excellent coverage of the narrative. So as Tom pointed out, people are the council members are both hearing this and sometimes believing it, and sometimes they're intentionally putting it forward. So we don't want to make any assumptions that we don't know about, but this is the pervasive narrative that we're trying to fight. So I'm gonna pose this question to Katie. What can we do fight back, because we always have the call to action at our workshops, and generally it's just a form email, but I think that this is kind of a unique circumstance.
Yeah, well, I mean, like Kate has outlined, we are assuming that there are going to be efforts in the coming months to repeal and or water down some of Seattle's renter protection laws. And so, I mean, one thing that I think we need to be prepared to do is to go in person, anyone who can, when these things are talked about, to testify and to be there and to speak as a renter, to the council members at City Hall. I think we have a council that really probably values in-person attendance a lot more than Zoom attendance, although you know, Zoom attendance is probably better than nothing. And you know, the other thing that I think Kate mentioned is that you know, a crowd of rowdy activists is probably not going to sway them. Now, we don't know if anything will sway them. This might just be a losing battle in the short term, but if anything's going to sway them, it's probably hearing from people who live in their district, who are renters, who can kind of put a human face on why we need these laws. And so I think one strategy that the Stay House, Stay Healthy Coalition is trying to implement is having basically people who live in these council member districts going to their office hours or requesting a meeting in person or over Zoom to talk about why these protections are important, especially if there's specific ones that, you know, have helped you in your situation as a renter. And also, you know, we can provide support in doing that, right? So if you score a meeting, or if you're planning to go to office hours and you want a buddy, if you need to practice, you know, practice what you're going to say, if you want help with talking points, like we can provide that support. So yeah, I think over the next month or so, it would be really good for them to start hearing and hearing from and getting meeting requests from the people who live in their districts. Oh, you're muted, Kate.
Thank you. Tanya, will you share screen again? So the call to action tonight is to meet with your council members. Send them an email, tell them who you are, share what's relevant of your identity, you're a renter, you're a parent, you're a member of a union, you know, you're a worker, you're on disability, whatever is your student, whatever is relevant to the conversation, and ask to have a conversation with them about what it's like being a renter here in Seattle, and what they're going to do to ensure that you can stay here in Seattle. So Dee will drop the emails to the council members in the chat in just a second. So we didn't write a template for you. I know we generally do for the call to action, but this should be just sincere and from you. And then if they respond and say, yes, I'd love to meet with you, you have a lot of the information about what we're concerned about, but we are happy to coach you on this. And then when we're thinking long-term, we're thinking about like how to combat displacement, how to ensure that these rental protections stay in place permanently. That's like a big conversation that we are having. Oh, how do renters find out exactly who their council member is? So Dee, after you finish dropping the emails in the chat, would you mind putting the link? There is a spot on the website where you can just enter your address and it will tell you who your council member is. So Council President Sarah Nelson and then Council Member Wu are everyone's council member because those are citywide positions. And then you just need to find out which district you live in. Oh, there it is. Thank you, Dee. And so if you want to get involved in this fight longer term, please consider joining the Seattle Renter Organizing Council. Right now, we are discussing how to move forward with potentially getting a separate office created that would hold landlords actually accountable. That was something that I did actually, that just triggered in my mind that we didn't really cover in the small landlord narrative, but any landlord narrative, is that we have all this like robust set of tenant protections, sort of. What needs to be, I think, repeated often is that landlords don't really get in trouble for violating these laws. If the unit isn't up to code, if they are not issuing notices in the way that they're supposed to, the goal of the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections is voluntary compliance. So as long as the landlord like goes back and corrects whatever mistake they made, it's considered all good. Like they're not actually facing any consequences for not knowing the laws, even though there's so many to remember. And they're really setting this narrative that like they're going to be harshly punished if they don't follow the law. But it's not true. I was in a meeting and one of the landlords said, it's an $11,000 fine if you violate the first in time ordinance. And no one has ever paid that much, ever. It requires like a deep level of investigation. So a lot of times like council members like hear those things and they don't actually process it. Like that is not how the system is set up. And there's no real way for renters to get restitution when their rights have been violated unless they bring the landlord to small claims court or sue the landlord, which most renters do not have the means to do. So having a different office, a separate office that could potentially offer robust enforcement of tenant protections, where there would be some level of landlord accountability, is something to think about in the long term, something that we've been organizing towards. And we're still trying to figure out what that looks like and how to build power towards it. But it's been tossed around like maybe we need to run an initiative. And I know that there's some interest from some other groups in supporting that work. So that's something that interests you. Please join us at the Seattle Renter Organizing Council every month on the second Thursday at 6:30 p.m. at El Centro de la Raza. We provide dinner, and we also have a little Discord group on the side. If you join, we can add you to. And with that, we're ending a little bit early, 7:45 p.m. I just want to thank Katie for participating and giving that incredible overview on the landlord narrative, because it's really important. Wait, Tanya, can you share screen one more time? Go to the goodbye slide, because it's like my favorite part of our presentation. Alrighty. Thank you all so much for coming.